On a beach in the East Mediterranean, not far from Haifa, lie the colossal ruins of a once great city. 3,000 years ago, the city of Dor boasted massive stone-built battlements and a finely equipped harbor. It was a citadel of the Sea Peoples, a name the ancient Egyptians gave to several groups, including the Phoenicians, who were eventually crushed by the Israelites under King David. For 12 seasons, an international team has excavated the massive ruins here. On August the 13th, 1992, University of California archaeologist Andrew Stewart was just about to wind up another season at the dig. One more day of hurried recording and cleanup was left. And then, the unexpected happened.
And Ranbir, the square supervisor, came over to me after about half an hour and said, Andy, it was about that rubble that you asked us to dig. And I said, yeah. I said, we got rid of it yet? He said, actually, we got rid of most of it, but there's a foot sticking out of it, and it's human.
For the next 11 hours, the team raced to uncover the skeleton pinned under the rubble. As the bones emerged, so did the clues. The pelvis was broad, and so could only have belonged to a woman. The excavators judged that she was in her 30s. Her body was contorted, and her arms were raised up as if to protect herself. But the effort had been in vain. Ephraim Stern, who has worked at Dor for 21 years, believes the woman was a casualty of King David's attack on the city around 1000 BC.
The Phoenician city had been captured by the Israelites during the beginning of the 10th century by the armies of David. So she was killed when the city had been captured by the army, by the soldiers, and her body, like the body of many other people, have been left where she was killed and exactly where we found her.
But Stern's collaborator, Andrew Stewart, disagrees. He thinks the woman was killed by a collapsing stone wall.
Nothing that we found as we were digging her suggested to us that human violence was in any way involved. There was no knife sticking into her body or anything like that. But more importantly, everything that we found was consistent with almost a split-second accident. It didn't seem to us at all that she had been, say, murdered, then somebody pushed a wall over on her. It looked to me as though it was a single event which contorted and crushed her.
Stewart's view was tested when the bones were examined at the Hebrew University Medical School. Anthropologist Patricia Smith found no cut marks such as might have been inflicted by a knife or a sword. The bones were smashed into many fragments.
The question was, could I find any evidence on the skeleton to determine how this individual died? Well, as you can see, most of the bones are fragmented, but if we look here especially, we can see here and here this spiral fracture that I was talking about, and if you look very carefully, you can see that there's a raised edge here. This is the sort of fracture that only occurs in fresh bone. This particular break definitely occurred either when she was still alive or immediately after she died.
Buried among the ruins of her pantry for 3,000 years, the crushed and twisted remains of a young woman seem to confirm the biblical account of David's conquest of the Phoenicians. Or perhaps they tell of a greater conflict, the shifting of massive plates beneath the Earth's crust.
I think what happened, judging by the rocks that we found on her, was that the wall began to fall, for whatever reason. She turned around to flee, and it caught her as she was turning around. And a rock seems to have hit her in the pelvis, another in the rib cage, and a third on the head. And when she turned, her foot twisted and broke.
As she fell to the floor, broken potsherds and animal bones sliced into her body. The impact of the stones broke her neck and shattered her skull. But what caused the stones to fall? The earthquake possibility has been pursued by earth scientist Amos Nur. He thinks there's good evidence that at least 9 other sites in northern Israel suffered severe damage around 1000 BC, the date of Dor's destruction. His quest for clues about ancient earthquakes took on a dramatic new meaning one day in October 1989.
For many years I studied earthquakes as a theoretical thing, like many scientists do. Until the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California, I was in my office at Stanford University, and my office completely collapsed during the earthquake. I dove under my desk just a split second before my huge steel bookcase came down. It was that experience in 1989 that transformed me from an earthquake theoretician to a practitioner. And I decided I really want to understand this, the human aspect of past earthquakes, not just the theory.
The 1989 quake killed 67 people. 1 year earlier, a quake in Armenia killed as many as 25,000 people. Though we understand earthquakes better than in Old Testament times, they are still as lethal. Geologists tell us that some places are predisposed to earthquakes, and their occurrence is as inevitable as it is unpredictable. This was the scene in Jerusalem in 1927, when an earthquake only slightly weaker than those in California and Armenia struck. The threat lies in the two great fault systems that cut across the Holy Land. One runs north-south. Along it lie the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan, and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea itself was created when two giant pieces of the Earth's crust split and spread apart along what is known as the Asia-Africa Rift. At 400 meters below sea level, it is the lowest point on the Earth's surface. A smaller fault follows the mountains known as the Mount Carmel Ridge and runs into the Mediterranean just north of Dor. Earthquakes occur as the plates on each side of the fault periodically slip, tear, and grind against each other, producing some of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. Earth scientists seek to find a pattern in these violent events. To learn what clues an earthquake leaves behind, Nur studied the Hellenistic and Roman ruins at Beit Shan. A well-documented quake struck here in 749 AD, leaving a dramatic tableau of devastation.
For earthquakes and archaeology, Beit Shan is truly unique, because we know that an earthquake happened here, and we see its effects. For example, here we see a cracked column that collapsed here. Here is another stone layer, and altogether they were the facade of this temple, which must have risen to about 50 feet right above the street. And during the earthquake, all this structure fell into this main street of Beit Shan, as you see it right here. We see many other things, more subtle. Buckled street. We see, for example, the staircase here that got completely distorted and tilted by this earthquake. We see here the separation between the blocks and the stairs, and here, and the slippage between these blocks due to this earthquake here. The importance of this evidence is that it gives us a calibration for effects in places where we don't know that an earthquake has happened.
But proving that earthquakes happen isn't always easy. These are the ruins of Megiddo, a city that lies at a crucial gap in the Mount Carmel Ridge. For thousands of years, traders and armies have sought this pass through the mountains. It has witnessed dozens of bloody battles, including the crushing defeat of the Turks by British forces under General Allenby in 1918. But long ago, Megiddo apparently suffered another kind of destruction, and its name, translated by the Greeks into Armageddon, became synonymous with the ultimate cataclysm. Its apocalyptic end is familiar to us from the book of Revelation. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there were voices, and thunders, and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake such as was not seen since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake, and so great. Was Armageddon inspired by a real event? Though the ancient city of Megiddo was located at a strategically vital pass through the mountains, its position was vulnerable. Megiddo's inhabitants, who left layer after layer of refuse here beginning 8,000 years ago, may have learned to live with disaster. Famed Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin dug here in 1960 and found many bones crushed under mud brick walls. The date of the disaster was about the same as the one at Dor, 1000 BC. Yadin blamed the damage on King David's attack on the site, even though the Bible does not list Megiddo among his conquests. Nur thinks his own explanation is more plausible. Because Megiddo sits right on top of the Mount Carmel fault and is only 30 miles from the bigger Dead Sea fault, he believes a giant earthquake struck Megiddo and inspired the biblical prophecy of Armageddon.
The reason I think that Armageddon is associated with earthquakes are, besides the fact that it's sitting on an active fault, in fact, we know there are earthquakes here, we know there were earthquakes here, so this place was shaken many times. And if you look at the construction, or like the wall behind me, this is very poor anti-seismic construction. In the book of Revelation, the description is of a huge battle, which will be accompanied by an enormous earthquake, such a one that has never happened. The earthquake will crack the city into 3 parts. It will make the mountains disappear. It will make the ocean recede. The movement of the ocean is a tsunami. We know it from any earthquake. The cracking of the city into parts is just the typical collapse of these cities. Somehow they have an extremely precise description of an earthquake to happen in the future.
Yet another site in northern Israel has yielded signs of earthquakes. The great mound of Hatzor lies a few miles from the Sea of Galilee. More than 3,000 years ago, it was an important cult center of the Canaanites. Later, under the reign of King Solomon, the city became a key strategic center for the Israelites. Amnon ben Tor has dug here for the last 4 years.
Most of what you can see today on the Acropolis of Hatzor, where we are, dates to the Israelite period. It starts with the 10th century, not the city, but the monument that I'm referring to, the gate just behind us and the city wall, attributed to the 10th century to King Solomon. It is mentioned in the Book of Kings that Solomon built Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, 3 large sites in the country, and most probably this is indeed of the days of King Solomon. Well, we can tell by the pottery that it is of the 10th century. So this is one important monument.
Yigal Yadin also dug at Hatzor in the 1960s. Though he seems to have ignored the possibility of earthquake damage at Megiddo, the idea suddenly took hold of him at Hatzor. The crucial evidence came from Stratum 6.
Stratum 6, according to Yadin, was destroyed sometime towards the middle of the 8th century by an earthquake referred to in the biblical narrative, the famous earthquake in the time of Amos. And the archaeological evidence for that, according to Yadin, is that many of the walls which he found are tilted, and this, according to Yadin, cannot be explained by any human destruction, any human causes. Only nature could create such a destruction, hence earthquake.
Yadin linked the tilted walls he'd uncovered to an earthquake mentioned in 2 Old Testament books, Amos and Zechariah. Most biblical scholars put the date at around 760 BC.
In Hatzor, for example, we have a beautiful case of destruction by an earthquake. It's beautiful because in the site itself, there is tremendous evidence for collapse of a building and broken parts and so on. And we also have a biblical description of the same earthquake. It happens during Uzziah's time in about 750 BCE, and presumably devastated the entire country.
It is perhaps too easy to attribute a city's destruction to an earthquake. Over the millennia, buildings fall, ground shifts, battles are fought. Hatzor's tilted walls could have any number of explanations.
Indeed, there are many walls which are tilted at Hatzor. There may be other causes, the topography, the slope. I don't know if anyone would ever be able to be positive about the cause of destruction here. So for the time being, it's a nice story, it's a nice interpretation, it's a nice possibility, but to say that we are 100% certain, I don't think we can.
The terror of earthquakes is synonymous with destruction and death. But in one of the most familiar yet curious of all Old Testament stories, an earthquake may be considered a miracle. The saga of Joshua recounts how his soldiers blew on their trumpets and caused the walls of Jericho to come tumbling down. One thing is certain, a great walled city did stand here, at an important crossroads just north of the Dead Sea. Excavations in the 1930s and 1950s revealed Jericho to be one of the oldest cities in the world. Around 6000 BC, they fortified Jericho with tremendously strong walls. On the west side was a round stone tower no less than 23 feet high. The Jericho that Joshua's army may have confronted belongs to a later era, around 1400 BC. Here, archaeologists have also found evidence of huge defensive walls and the victims of a violent disaster.
The skeletons that were found in Jericho were crushed. They weren't just buried or put in the ground. They were crushed with broken limbs, and one of them had a huge stones right on top of it. To us, it implies that some big collapse was involved in killing these two people. Aside from skeletons, jars with grain were found in Jericho and other foodstuff that was also covered by rubble. And it probably means that it wasn't an attack of an army, it was some kind of catastrophe that buried these foodstuff, and that's where they stayed.
Noah thinks an earthquake can explain another puzzling element in the Joshua story.
During the 1927 earthquake, or because of it, the Jordan River stopped flowing because of slumps into the river from the banks of the river. The same thing happened many times before, as we know from historical records. And the remarkable thing is in the description of Joshua's conquest of Jericho, there's also a description how the Jordan River went dry and the Israelites crossed it while it wasn't flowing. The stories and the events are so similar to what we have seen in 1927 and other earthquakes. It makes it a very compelling case that an earthquake was involved in the collapse of the walls of Jericho and the conquest of the city by Joshua and his army.
Archaeologists such as Amnon Ben-Tor are cautious about taking the Bible too literally.
Because a lot of what you read in the Bible is in itself in interpretation of somebody who interpreted events that happened before his time. So the question is, what do you take as evidence? Okay, this is the question. Once we agreed on this, definitely the Bible should be used, must be used to illustrate, to corroborate, to fill in gaps. The same thing goes also for archaeology. Archaeology can give meaning, can fill in gaps in our understanding and so on. So it goes both ways. Archaeology and the Bible have to be linked.
As far as Noah is concerned, his quest for the truth behind stories such as Joshua and Sodom and Gomorrah is more than mere academic curiosity.
What we hope to get out of the study of historical earthquakes and the archaeological evidence is to get an idea about the time-space pattern of large or moderate earthquakes. And in order to do that, we have to go to places where we have very long historical record. This is the best place to do so. Hopefully in the future we're going to get some idea of whether there is a precise repeat time or some other pattern in earthquake which could help us tremendously in figuring out how to predict earthquakes in the future. We want to use the past to predict the future, if possible.
By tracking the incidence of earthquakes in the Middle East, Noah hopes to arrive at a means for predicting future quakes. His study of ancient catastrophe may alert us to the role of earthquakes in the Holy Land and help prepare us for the inevitable shocks to come. In every age, the threat of earthquakes has aroused a special, chilling fear. Modern science helps us to understand the forces deep within the earth that give rise to these terrifying events, even if the goal of prediction remains elusive. But how much more frightening it must have been then for the people of Dor or Megiddo or Jericho when their world suddenly collapsed around them. Little wonder such catastrophes were attributed to the vengeance of God and passed into the realm of biblical legend.
Bible says mankind's first home was a garden paradise called Eden. God created Adam and Eve to tend the garden. He warned them never to eat from the tree of knowledge. One day, a serpent hissed a jealous message to Eve. If you eat the forbidden fruit, you will become as wise as your Creator. The first woman and man succumbed to temptation. His creations would next eat from the tree of life. He cast Adam and Eve from the garden and gave mankind a legacy of earthly toil. There is another legacy, a longing to rediscover the place where it all began. The dawn of civilization is thought to have occurred in that part of the world we now call the Middle East. The Great Pyramids of Egypt have endured nearly 5,000 years. In the epic journey of mankind, however, they are relatively recent milestones. The builders of the pyramids grappled with the same question that puzzles modern men. Where did it all begin? One answer lies in the Judeo-Christian tradition of an earthly paradise that existed somewhere in the Middle East. Biblical scholars have devoted lifetimes to interpreting the section of Genesis which describes the location of Eden. A passage in the Old Testament states that Eden was watered by a stream which rose out of the garden and branched out into 4 rivers: the Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. The Tigris and Euphrates are familiar enough. But what are the Pishon and Gihon? Where are they in the modern world? The great river of Egypt is the Nile, thought by some to be the Gihon of Genesis. There would be no city of Cairo without the Nile, only desert. To the ancients, the river was a god. All their great monuments and temples were built near its banks. At Karnak took nearly a decade to quarry, transport, and erect. The holiest of monuments here was not stone, however. It was the sacred pool, symbol of life in the desert. Water is a recurrent theme in all accounts of mankind's beginnings. If we assume that the Nile is the western boundary of the search for Eden, it is to the rising sun that we must look for clues to the location of the 4th river. Karnak is the Red Sea, separating Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. Freighters and tankers have recently inundated these waters, but the coast of Arabia is no stranger to commerce. Jeddah is the major seaport, bustling with the enormous wealth Arab oil has brought. Modern office buildings are rising from the arid soil, rapidly crowding out the ramshackle structures of an earlier, quieter time. Jeddah is the Arabic word for grandmother, and although the city is the gateway to the holiest shrines of Islam, it has great significance to Christians and Jews as well. A rubble-strewn plot of ground is all that remains of a great Christian shrine destroyed by Muslim zealots in 1928. The shrine marked the legendary tomb of Eve, grandmother of humanity. The burden of their fall from grace weighed heavily on Adam and Eve. Tradition has it they separated when they were cast out from Eden. Eve made her way across the desert to the place that is her namesake, Jeddah. There, she died. Of all the modern Arab states, Arabia clings most tenaciously to its past. It is the land of Mohammed, and long before him, the great Jewish king Solomon mined gold here. Legends are not easily dismissed in a place with such a rich history. Arabia is a land of seeming contradictions. Gasoline is virtually free, but water is sold for 25 cents a glass. Part of the price, perhaps, for Eve's temptation. Men are taught that toil was the legacy of Adam and Eve's fall. The same tradition which says Eve wandered in the desert says Adam struggled in the Judean wilderness. In Judea, nomads still tend their flocks in the hills above the Dead Sea. Beyond the wilderness is Jerusalem, where the old ways are honored as they are in Jeddah. Pious Jews chant prayers at a wall built 2,000 years ago by Herod. Near this sacred and ancient place, Adam is said to have emerged from the wilderness. A beautiful mosque stands above Herod's wall. It is among the most sacred shrines of the Muslim faith. The delicate Arabic script inlaid in tile is from the Quran. It tells of Muhammad's struggle to return mankind to the purity Eden represents to all faiths. The great dome of the mosque vaults an ancient place with immense religious significance. On an ancient rock, Abraham is said to have offered to sacrifice his son. Muhammad is believed to have stepped from the rock into heaven. It is also the place, one tradition says, where Adam returned to die. The persistent question remains, where is the fourth river mentioned in Genesis? The traditional resting places of Adam and Eve are east of the Nile. East of Jeddah and Jerusalem are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In the second millennium before Christ, that part of the world watered by the two rivers was ruled by the Assyrians. They were searching for paradise too, and may have found it in the great gulf where the Tigris and Euphrates empty.
I am Ashurbanipal, king of the Assyrians. My legions are the most powerful on earth. From Mesopotamia, we strike west into Egypt, and south into the Gulf of Araby. There's great wealth in the Gulf, wealth to feed my armies. But there's more. Stories of a place called Dilmun. It's said that no one dies there, and the natives pluck pearls from the ocean like dates from a palm. If there is such a place, it shall be mine.
Into the Gulf, Ashurbanipal sent advance elements of his army. The scouts returned with incredible reports. It seemed there was a land called Dilmun. The inhabitants did pluck pearls from the ocean like dates from a palm. Flowers bloomed, scenting the air with their perfume. The date palms were heavy with fruit. Ashurbanipal's men had never seen such abundance. Everywhere there was greenery, lush and inviting. On a Dilmun seal, a tree flanked by two mysterious figures. The record of Ashurbanipal's expedition gives us one of the earliest indications that Adam and Eve's garden might have existed, might still exist. Thus, the key to finding Eden and the fourth river of Genesis may lie in finding Dilmun, somewhere in the Persian Gulf. To understand the Middle East, one must study the sea. Long before the ancient Phoenicians were probing the Mediterranean from their harbors in modern-day Lebanon, the great ocean gulf separating Arabia from Persia was already alive with commerce. The same tools and techniques that built ancient sailing ships are still in use today. Nautical craftsmanship has been handed down through 100 generations. With little more than a saw and their memories, these men build the sturdy boats that sail the Gulf. From Arabia in the west come ships laden with date wine and spun cotton. From Persian cities in the east, the ships return with exotic vegetables and spices from India. Many nations have claimed the Gulf as their own. One place has seen them all come and move on. Bahrain is a small island off the east coast of Arabia. Its people have enjoyed an influence far beyond their numbers or the size of their homeland. Through Bahrain's seaport at Manama City flows the wealth of the Gulf. The islands have been independent only since 1971. Before that, Bahrain was a British protectorate. Before that, it was Persian. Before that, Portuguese. Many nations have ruled Bahrain, but she has always retained an exotic individuality. Perhaps nowhere else in the Arab world is there a stronger work ethic. The day begins early. By noon, it is too hot to work. Breakfast may be fresh Arab bread. A bitter green coffee is ritually shared by merchants preparing for the day. By 5 a.m., the vegetable market is ready for business. Each vendor is a specialist, selling melon from Egypt, citrus from Lebanon, or lush homegrown produce. The merchants squat in the dust, ready to bargain. It has been this way for thousands of years. Bahrain has a resiliency that allows old and new to exist in harmony. A modern refinery turns Saudi Arabian oil into gasoline. The Bahrainis have little oil themselves. They do have the ability to exploit a good thing when they see it. By being invaluable to bigger, more powerful neighbors, Bahrain assures its unique place in the world. The pulse of the Gulf may well be the rush of oil through pipelines, but oil plays no part in Genesis. Water is the fluid of Eden, nectar of the desert. To keep decorative trees alive under Bahrain's brutal sun, they must be watered daily. Water is Bahrain's secret. The Potter's Kiln is built into a huge rock mound that may tell much about Bahrain's special relationship with water. There are dozens of the large mounds on the island. Archaeologist P.B. Cornwall was the first to recognize their significance. In 1940, he dug into one of the mounds and discovered that it was a tomb, probably a royal tomb, and probably older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. 5,000 years older than the modern graveyard at its base. There are perhaps 50,000 smaller mounds on the island, most of them long since looted. They tell us that the ancient population of Bahrain was large and affluent, rich enough to accord death a status surpassed only by the pharaohs of Egypt. And they place this lost civilization in the same millennium as the Assyrian domination of the north. When King Ashurbanipal sent his men to find Dilmun, they returned with reports of a civilization that defied death. Near an oasis is the ghost of a much later military expedition. In the 16th century, the Portuguese invaded Bahrain and built a fort to protect their trade route to the Far East. Without realizing it, the invaders were building on the ruins of a civilization that had dominated the same trade routes long before their Portuguese ancestors had ever put to sea. The first major excavation of the site was begun in 1953 by Professor Geoffrey Bibby. It revealed a sophisticated dwelling, complete with what appears to be an altar. More intriguing was the discovery of a limestone basin, which probably held fresh water. The reservoir fed into a walled channel built 20 feet below the surface of the ground, clearly an advanced irrigation system. The underground water supply could be tapped from well-like chimneys constructed along the course of the channel. Bibby thought they probably served the additional function of allowing silt deposits to be removed from the waterway. Dozens of the stone chimneys appear in the desert at intervals of about 100 yards. Fresh water remains abundant elsewhere on the island, welling up from the ground to fill natural rock basins. Bahrain is surrounded by the salt waters of the Gulf. The sea is absorbed into the limestone bedrock of the island and percolates upward in a natural filtration process. The result is the most wonderful of all things in the desert, a miracle, an oasis. If we are to believe Genesis, then Adam and Eve must have frolicked in just such a place. Perhaps we have found the fourth river, which the Bible says takes us to Eden. It may very well be the great river flowing beneath Bahrain. Where there is water in Bahrain, the desert explodes with life and color. If we take Genesis as a mixture of revelation and allegory, then it is likely the author had a real place in mind when he described Eden. You might have been familiar with the Sumerian legend of the semi-divine king named Gilgamesh. In search of immortality, Gilgamesh travels to the land of Dilmun. There, Gilgamesh learns that he must pursue the flower of immortality, which is found at the bottom of the sea. By eating the flower, Gilgamesh will become immortal. The story doesn't end happily. A serpent appears, steals the flower, and eats it. Man's old adversary once again robs him of everlasting life. The biblical similarities are obvious. There is more, however. The flower of immortality at the bottom of the sea could be a figure of speech for the pearls Bahrain is famous for. The ancient inhabitants of Bahrain had a peculiar custom. In their burial mounds, they placed a basket. Inside the basket, they placed a snake and a symbolic pearl. On Bahrain, as in Genesis, the garden gives way to desert. Few creatures willingly leave the oasis to take their chances in the wilderness just beyond the last blade of grass. Adam and Eve had a choice. They chose knowledge instead of life and were cast out. Mankind's prospects seemed bleak as the interior of Bahrain. If there's a single lesson to be learned from the great faiths, however, perhaps it is hope. The tree of life may not be lost forever. In one last astonishing parallel to the biblical Eden, we find a great tree growing in the Bahrain waste. It seems to thrive where nothing else can. Its shade beckons across the sun-bathed desert floor. Few of the people who live on this island have ever heard of the Garden of Eden, yet they call this the Tree of Life. If we never again achieve the garden, it will certainly not be because we lost our way in our dreams. There is intense curiosity among a handful of scholars and scientists who know that the real story of Bahrain hasn't been told. Money for archaeological work is always scarce, and what there is of it is more likely to be spent on glamour digs in Egypt. Those who work here do so out of deep commitment. Piecing together a lost civilization is not as easy as piecing together a pot. Time may be running out. Saudi Arabia plans to build a causeway from the mainland to Bahrain. It will cut through thousands of Dilmun burial mounds. It would be tragic to lose the Garden of Eden a second time.